Chapter 8 of Return of the Mucker by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Joe DeNoia, Somerset, New Jersey. Billy's First Command. And so it was that, having breakfast in the morning, Bridge and Miguel started downward toward the valley, protected by an escort under Captain Billy Byrne. An old service jacket and a wide-brimmed hat, both donated by brother officers, constituted Captain Byrne's uniform. His mount was the largest that the picket line of Poseda's forces could produce. Billy loomed large amongst his men. For an hour they rode along the trail, Billy and Bridge conversing upon various subjects, none of which touched upon the one uppermost in the mind of each. Miguel rode, silent and preoccupied. The evening before he had whispered something to Bridge as he had crawled out of the darkness to lie close to the American, and during a brief moment that morning Bridge had found an opportunity to relay the Mexican's message to Billy Byrne. The latter had but raised his eyebrows a trifle at the time, but later he smiled more than was usual with him. Something seemed to please him immensely. Beside him at the head of the column rode Bridge and Miguel. Behind them trailed the 6 swarthy little troopers, the picked men upon whom Poseda could depend. They had reached a point where the trail passes through a narrow, dry arroyo, which the waters of the rainy season had cut deep into the soft, powdery soil. Upon either bank grew cacti and mesquite, forming a sheltered screen behind which a regiment might have hidden. The place was ideal for an ambuscade. "Here, Senor Captain," whispered Miguel, as they neared the entrance to the trap. A low hill shut off from their view all but led the head of the cut, and it also hid them from the sight of any possible enemy which might have been lurking in wait for them further down the arroyo. At Miguel's words, Byrne wheeled his horse to the right away from the trail which led through the bottom of the waterway and around the base of the hill, or rather in that direction, for it scarce deviated from the direct way before one of the troopers spurred to his side, calling out in Spanish that he was on the wrong trail. "What's this guy chewing about?" asked Billy, turning to Miguel. "He says you must keep to the arroyo, Senor Captain," explained the Mexican. "Tell him to go back into the stall," was Byrne's laconic rejoinder, and he pushed his mount forward to pass the brigand. The soldier was voluble in his objections. Again he reined in front of Billy, and by the time his 5 fellows had spurred forward to block his way. Again he reined in front of Billy, and by this time his 5 fellows had spurred forward to block the way. "This is the wrong trail," they cried. "Come this other way, Captain. Poseta has so ordered." Catching the drift of their remarks, Billy waved them to one side. "I'm bossing this picnic," he announced. "Get out of the way and be quick about it if you don't want to be hurted." Again he rode forward. Again the troopers interposed their mounts, and this time their leader cocked his carbine. His attitude was menacing. Billy was close to him. Their ponies were shoulder to shoulder, that of the bandit almost broadside of the trail. Now Billy Byrne was more than passing well acquainted with many of the fundamental principles of sudden brawls. It is safe to say that he had never heard of Van Bibber, but he knew, as well as Van Bibber knew, that it was well to hit first. Without a word and without warning he struck. Leading forward with all the weight of his body behind his blow, and catching the man full beneath the chin, he lifted him as neatly from his saddle as though a battering ram had struck him. Simultaneously Bridge and Miguel drew revolvers from their shirts, and as Billy wheeled his pony toward the remaining 5, they opened fire upon them. The battle was short and sweet. One almost escaped, but Miguel, who proved to be an excellent revolver shot, brought him down at 100 yards. He then, with utter disregard for the rules of civilized warfare, dispatched those who were not already dead. "We must let none return to carry false tales to Peseta," he explained. Even Billy Byrne winced at the ruthlessness of the cold-blooded murders, but he realized the necessity which confronted them, though he could not have brought himself to do the things which the Mexican did with such sang-froid and even evident enjoyment. "Now for the others," cried Miguel, when he assured himself that each of the 6 were really quite dead. Spurring after him, Billy and Bridge ran their horses over the rough ground at the base of the little hill, and then parallel to the arroyo for a matter of 100 yards, where they espied 2 Indians, carbines in hand, standing in evident consternation because of the unexpected fusillade of shots which they had just heard and which they were unable to account for. At the sight of the 3 the sharpshooters dropped behind cover and fired. Billy's horse stumbled at the first report, caught himself, reared high upon its hind legs, and then toppled over, dead. His rider, throwing himself to one side, scrambled to his feet and fired twice at the partially concealed men. Miguel and Bridge rode in rapidly to close quarters, firing as they came. One of the 2 men Peseta had sent to assassinate his guests dropped his gun, clutched at his breast, screamed, and sank back behind a clump of mesquite. The other turned and leaped over the edge of the bank into the arroyo, rolling and tumbling to the bottom in a cloud of dry dust. As he rose to his feet and started on a run up the bed of the dry stream, Dodging a zigzag course from one bit of scant cover to another, Billy Byrne stepped to the edge of the washout and threw his carbine to his shoulder. His face was flushed, his eyes sparkled, a smile lighted his regular features. "This is the life," he cried, and pulled the trigger. The man beneath him, running for his life like a frightened jackrabbit, sprawled forward upon his face, made a single effort to rise, and then slumped limply down, forever. Miguel and Bridge, dismounted now, came to Byrne's side. The Mexican was grinning broadly. "The captain is one grand fighter," he said. "How my dear general would admire such a man as the captain. Doubtless he would make him a colonel. Come with me, Senor Captain, and your fortune is made." "Come where?" asked Billy Byrne. "To the camp of the liberator of poor bleeding Mexico. To General Francisco Villa." "Nothin' doin'," said Byrne. "I'm hooked up with this Pesita person now, and I guess I'll stick. He's given me more of a run for my money in the last 24 hours than I've had since I parted from my dear old friend, the Lord of Yoka." "But, Senor Captain," cried Miguel, "you did not mean to say that you were going back to Pesita. He will shoot you down with his own hand when he has learned what has happened here." "I guess not," said Billy. "You'd better go with Miguel, Billy," urged Bridge. "Pesita will not forgive you this. You've cost him 8 men today, and he hasn't any more men than he needs at best. Besides, you've made a monkey of him, and unless I miss my guess you'll have to pay for it." "No," said Billy. "I kinda like this Pesita gent. I think I'll stick around with him for a while yet. Anyhow, until I've had a chance to see his face after I've made my report to him. You guys run along now and make your getaway good, and I'll beat it back to camp." He crossed to where the 2 horses of the slain marksman were hidden, turned one of them loose, and mounted the other. "So long, bows," he cried, and with a wave of his hand wheeled about and spurred back along the trail over which they had just come. Miguel and Bridge watched him for a moment, then they, too, mounted and turned away in the opposite direction. Bridge recited no verse for the balance of the day. His heart lay heavy in his bosom, for he missed Billy Byrne, and he was fearful of the fate which awaited him in the camp of the bandit. Billy, blithe as a lark, rode gaily back along the trail to camp. He looked forward with unmixed delight to his coming interview with Pesita, and to the wild, half-savage life which association with the bandit promised. All his life had Billy Byrne fed upon excitement and adventure. As a gangster, thug, hold-up man, and second-story artist, Billy had found food for his appetite within the dismal, sooty streets of Chicago's great West Side, and then fate had flung him upon the savage shore of Yoka to find other forms of adventure where the best that is in a strong man may be brought out in the stern battle for existence against primeval men and conditions. The West Side had developed only Billy's basest characteristics. He might have slipped back easily into the old ways had it not been for her and the recollection of that which he had read in her eyes. Love had been there, but greater than that to hold him hand into the straight and narrow path of decency and honor had been respect and admiration. It had seemed incredible to Billy that a goddess should fear such things for him, for the same man her scornful lips once had branded as coward and mucker. Yet he had read the truth aright, and since then Billy Byrne had done his best according to the light that had been given him to deserve the belief she had in him. So far there had crept into his consciousness no disquieting doubts as to the consistency of his recent action in joining the force of a depredating Mexican outlaw. Billy knew nothing of the political conditions of the republic. Had Pesita told him that he was president of Mexico, Billy could not have disputed the statement from any knowledge of facts that he possessed. As a matter of fact, about all Billy had ever known of Mexico was that it had some connection with an important place called Juarez, where running meets were held. To Billy Byrne, then, Pesita was a real general, and Billy himself a bona fide captain. He had entered an army which was at war with some other army. What they were warring about Billy did not know, nor did he care. There should be fighting, and he loved that. That much he knew. The ethics of Pesita's warfare troubled him not. He had heard that some great American general had said, "War is hell." Billy was willing to take his word for it, and accept anything which came in the guise of war as entirely proper as it should be. The afternoon was far gone when Billy drew rein in the camp of the outlaw band. Pesita, with the bulk of his raiders, was out upon some excursion to the north. Only half a dozen men lolled about, smoking or sleeping away the hot day. They looked at Billy in evident surprise when they saw him riding in alone, but they asked no questions, and Billy offered no explanation. His report was for the ears of Pesita only. The balance of the day Billy spent in acquiring further knowledge of Spanish, by conversing with those of the men who remained awake, and asking innumerable questions. It was almost sundown when Pesita rode in. 2 riderless horses were led by troopers in the rear of the little column, and 3 men swayed painfully in their saddles, and their clothing was stained with blood. Evidently Pesita had met with resistance. There was much voluble chattering on the part of those who had remained behind in their endeavors to extract from their returning comrades the details of the day's enterprises. By piecing together the various scraps of conversation he could understand, Billy discovered that Peseta had ridden far to demand tribute from a wealthy ranchero, only to find that word of his coming had preceded him and brought a large detachment of Villa's regulars, who concealed themselves about the house and outbuildings until Peseta and his entire force were well within close range. "We were lucky to get off as well as we did," said an officer. Billy grinned inwardly as he thought of the pleasant frame of mind in which Peseta might now be expecting to receive the news that 8 of his troopers had been killed and his 2 guests safely removed from the sphere of his hospitality. And even as his mind dwelt delightedly upon the subject, a ragged Indian carrying a carbine and with heavy silver spurs strapped to his bare feet approached and saluted him. "General Peseta wishes Senior Captain Byrne to report to him at once," said the man. "Sure, Mike," replied Billy, and made his way through the pandemonium of the camp toward the headquarters tent. As he went, he slipped his hand inside his shirt and loosened something which hung beneath his left arm. "Little ol' ace in the hole," he murmured affectionately. He found Peseta pacing back and forth before his tent, an energetic bundle of nerves which no amount of hard riding and fighting could tire or discourage. As Billy approached, Peseta shot a glance at his face that he might read, perhaps, in his new officer's expression whether anger or suspicion had been aroused by the killing of his American friend, for Peseta never dreamed but that Bridge had been dead since mid-forenoon. "Well," said Peseta, smiling, "you left Senor Bridge and Miguel safely at their destination?" "I couldn't take 'em all the way," replied Billy, "'cause I didn't have no more men to guard 'em with; but I seen 'em past the danger, I guess, and well on their way." "You had no men?" questioned Peseta. "We had 6 troopers." "Oh, they was all croaked before we had been gone 2 hours. You see it happened like this. We got as far as that dry arroyo just before the trail drops down into the valley, when up jumps a bunch of this here Villa's guys and commenced taking pot shots at 'em. Seeing as how I was sent to guard Bridge and Mig, I make them dismount and hunt cover, and then me and my men wades in and cleans up the bunch. There were only a few of them, but they croaked the whole bloomin' 6 of mine. I tell you it was some scrap while it lasted, but I saved your guest from getting hurted, and I know that's what you sent me to do. It's too bad about the 6 men we lost, but leave it to me. We'll get even with the Villa guy yet. Just leave me to him." As he spoke, Billy commenced scratching himself beneath the left arm, and then, as though to better reach the point of irritation, he slipped his hand inside his shirt. If Peseta noticed the apparent innocent little act, or interpreted correctly may or may not have been the fact. He stood looking straight into Byrne's eyes for a full minute. His face denoted neither baffled rage nor contemplated revenge. Presently a slow smile raised his heavy mustache and revealed his strong, white teeth. "You have done well, Captain Byrne," he said. "You are a man after my own heart," and he extended his hand. A half hour later Billy walked slowly back to his own blankets, and to say that he was puzzled would scarce have described his mental state. "I can't quite make this gink out," he mused. "Either he's a mighty good loser, or else he's a deep one who'll wait a year to get me the way he wants to get me." And Peseta a few moments later was saying to Captain Rosales, "I should have shot him if I could spare such a man, but it is seldom I find one with the courage and effrontery he possesses. Why, think of it, Rosales, he kills 8 of my men, lets my prisoners escape, and then dares to come back and tell me about it when he might easily have gotten away. Villa would have made him an officer for this thing, and Miguel must have told him so. He found out in some way about your little plan, and he turned the tables on us. We can use him, Rosales, but we must watch him. Also, my dear Captain, watch his right hand, and when he slips it into his shirt be careful that you do not draw on him, unless you happen to be behind him." Rosales was not inclined to take his chief's view of Byrne's value to them. He argued that the man was guilty of disloyalty and therefore a menace. What he thought, but did not advance as an argument, was a different nature. Rosales was filled with rage to think that the newcomer had outwitted him and beaten him at his own game, and he was jealous too of the man's ascendancy in the esteem of Peseta. But he hid his personal feelings beneath the cloak of seeming acquiescence to his chief's views, knowing that some day his time would come when he might rid himself of the danger of this obnoxious rival. "And tomorrow," continued Peseta, "I am sending him to Cuivaca. Villa has considerable funds in a bank there, and this stranger can learn what I want to know about the size of the detachment holding the town, and the habits of the garrison." End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Return of the Mucker by Edgar Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Joe DeNoia, Somerset, New Jersey. Barbara in Mexico. The manager of El Orobo Rancho was an American named Grayson. He was a tall, wiry man whose education had been acquired principally in the cow camps of Texas, where, among other things, one does not learn to love nor trust a greaser. As a result of this early training, Grayson was peculiarly unfitted in some respects to manage an American ranch in Mexico. But he was just a man, and so if his vaqueros did not love him, they at least respected him, and everyone who was or possessed the latent characteristics of wrongdoer feared him. Perhaps it is not fair to say that Grayson was in any way unfitted for the position he held, since as a matter of fact he was an ideal ranch foreman, and, if the truth be known, the simple fact that he was a gringo would have been sufficient to have won him the hatred of the Mexicans who worked under him, not in the course of their everyday relations, but when the fires of racial animosity were fanned to flame by some untoward incident upon either side of the border. Today Grayson was particularly rabid, the more so because he could not vent his anger upon the cause of it, who was no less a person than his boss. It seemed incredible to Grayson that any man of intelligence could have conceived and then carried out the full thing which the boss had just done, which was to have come from the safety of New York City to the hazards of warring Mexico, bringing, and this was the worst feature of it, his daughter with him. And at such a time, scarce a day had passed without rumors or reports of new affronts and even atrocities being perpetuated by American residents of Mexico. Each day, too, the gravity of these acts increased. From mere insult they had run of late to assault and even to murder. Nor was the end in sight. Peseta had openly sworn to rid Mexico of the gringo, to kill on sight every American who fell into his hands. And what could Grayson do in case of a determined attack upon the rancho? It is true he had 100 men, laborers and vaqueros, but scarce a dozen of these were Americans, and the rest would, almost without exception, follow the inclinations of consanguinity in case of trouble. To add to Grayson's irritability, he had just lost his bookkeeper, and if there was one thing more than any other that Grayson hated it was pen and ink. The youth had been a lunger from Iowa, a fairly nice little chap, and entirely suited to his duties under any other circumstances than those which prevailed in Mexico at the time. He was in mortal terror of his life every moment that he was awake, and at last had given in to the urge of cowardice and resigned. The day previous he had been bundled into the buckboard and driven over to the Mexican Central, which, at the time, still was operating trains, occasionally, between Chihuahua and Juarez. His mind filled with these unpleasant thoughts, Grayson sat at his desk in the office of the ranch trying to unravel the riddle of a balance sheet which would not balance. Mixed with the blue smoke from his briar was the deeper azure of a spirited monologue in which Grayson was engaged. A girl was passing the building at the moment. At her side walked a gray-haired man, one of those men whom you just naturally fit into a mental picture of a directors' meeting somewhere along Wall Street. "Sich language!" cried the girl, with a laugh, covering her ears with her palms. The man at her side smiled. "I can't say that I blame him much, Barbara," he replied. "It was a foolish thing for me to bring you down here at this time. I can't understand whatever possessed me to do it." "Don't blame yourself, dear," remonstrated the girl, "when it was all my fault. I begged and begged and begged until you had to consent. And I'm not sorry either. If nothing happens to you because of our coming, I couldn't stay in New York another minute. Everyone was so snoopy, and I could just tell that they were dying to ask questions about Billy and me." "I can't get it through my head yet, Barbara," said the man, "why in the world you broke with Billy Mallory. He's one of the finest young men in New York City today. Just my ideal of the sort of man I'd like my only daughter to marry." "I tried, Papa," said the girl in a low voice, "but I couldn't. I just couldn't." "Was it because—" The man stopped abruptly. "Well, never mind, dear. I shan't be snoopy too. Here now, you run along and do some snooping yourself about the ranch. I want to stop in and have a talk with Grayson." Down by one of the corrals where three men were busily engaged in attempting to persuade an unbroken pony that a spade bit is a pleasant thing to wear in one's mouth, Barbara found a seat upon a wagon box which commanded an excellent view of the entertainment going on within the corral. As she sat there experiencing a combination of admiration for the agility and courage of the men and pity for the horse, the tones of a pleasant masculine voice broke in upon her thoughts. "Out there somewhere, says I to me, by gosh, I guess that's poetry. Out there somewhere Penelope, with kisses on her mouth. And then, thinks I, oh college guy, your talk gets me in the eye. The north is creeping in the air, the birds are flying south." Barbara swung around to view the poet. She saw a slender man astride a fagged Mexican pony. A ragged coat and ragged trousers covered the man's nakedness. Indian moccasins protected his feet, while a torn and shapeless felt hat sat upon his well-shaped head. "American" was written all over him. No one could have imagined him anything else. Apparently he was a tramp as well. His apparel proclaimed him that, but there were two discordant notes in the otherwise harmonious ensemble of your typical beau. He was clean shaven and he rode a pony. He rode erect, too, with the easy seat of an army officer. At sight of the girl he raised his battered hat and swept it low to his pony's shoulder as he bent in a profound bow. "I seek the major domo, senorita," he said. "Mr. Grayson is up at the office, that little building to the left of the ranch house," replied the girl, pointing. The newcomer had addressed her in Spanish, and he heard her reply in pure and liquid English. His eyes widened a trifle, but the familiar smile with which he had greeted her left his face, and his parting bow was much more dignified, though no less profound than his predecessor. "And you, my sweet Penelope, out there somewhere you wait for me, with buds of roses in your hair and kisses on your mouth." Grayson and his employer both looked up as the words of Nib's poem floated into them through the open window. "I wonder where that blew in from," remarked Grayson as his eyes discovered Bridge astride the tired pony, looking at him through the window. A polite smile touched the stranger's lips as his eyes met Grayson's, and then wandered past him to the imposing figure of the Easterner. "Good evening, gentlemen," said Bridge. "Evening," snapped Grayson. "Go over to the cookhouse and the Chink will get you something to eat. Turn your pony in the lower pasture. Smith'll show you where to bunk tonight, and you can have your breakfast in the morning. So long." The ranch superintendent turned back to the paper in his hand, which he had been discussing with his employer at the moment of the interruption. He had volleyed his instructions at Bridge as though pouring a rain of lead from a machine gun, and now that he had said what he had to say the incident was closed insofar as he was concerned. The hospitality of the Southwest permitted no stranger to be turned away without food and a nice lodging. Grayson, having arranged for these, felt that he had done all that might be expected of a host, especially when the uninvited guest was so obviously a hobo and doubtless a horse thief as well, for who ever knew a hobo to own a horse? Bridge continued to sit where he had reined in his pony. He was looking at Grayson with what the discerning boss judged to be politely concealed enjoyment. "Possibly," suggested the boss in a whisper to his aide, "the man has business with you. You did not ask him, and I'm sure he said nothing about the wishing of a meal or a place to sleep." "Huh?" grunted Grayson, and then to Bridge, "Well, what the devil do you want?" "A job," replied Bridge, "or to be more explicit, I need a job. Far be it from me to wish one." The Easterner smiled. Grayson looked a bit mystified and irritated. "Well, I ain't got none," he snapped. "We don't need nobody now unless it might be a good puncher, one who can rope and ride." "I can ride," replied Bridge, as in evidenced by the fact that you now see me astride a horse. "I said ride," said Grayson. "Any fool can sit on a horse." "No, I ain't got nothing, and I'm busy now. Hold on," he exclaimed as though seized by a sudden inspiration. He looked sharply at Bridge for a moment and then shook his head sadly. "No, I'm afraid you couldn't do it. The guy's got to be educated for the job I got in mind." "Washing dishes?" suggested Bridge. Grayson ignored the playfulness of the other's question. "Keeping books," he explained. There was a finality in his tone which said, "As of course you cannot keep books, the interview is now over. Get out." "I could try," said Bridge. "I can read and write, you know. Let me try." Bridge wanted money for the trip to Rio, and, too, he wanted to stay in the country until Billy was ready to leave. "Savvy Spanish?" asked Grayson. "I read and write it better than I speak it," said Bridge, "though I do the latter well enough to get along anywhere that it is spoken." Grayson wanted a bookkeeper worse than he can ever recall having wanted anything before in his life. His better judgment told him that it was the height of idiocy to employ a ragged bum as a bookkeeper, but the bum was at least as much of a hope to him as is a straw to a drowning man, and so Grayson clutched at him. "Go and turn your cayuse in, and then come back here," he directed, "and I'll give you a tryout." "Thanks," said Bridge, and rode off in the direction of the pasture gate. "'Fraid he won't never do," said Grayson ruefully after Bridge had passed out of earshot. "I rather imagine that he will," said the boss. "He's an educated man, Grayson. You can tell that from his English, which is excellent. He's probably one of the great army of down and outers. This world is full of them, poor devils. Give him a chance, Grayson, and anyway he adds another American to our force, and each one counts." "Yes, that's right, but I hope you won't need 'em before you and Miss Barbara go," said Grayson. "I hope not, Grayson, but one can never tell with conditions here such as they are. Have you any hope that you will be able to obtain a safe conduct for us from General Villa?" "Oh, Villa'll give us the paper all right," said Grayson, "but it won't do us no good unless we don't meet nobody but Villa men on the way out. This here Pesita's the critter I'm leery of. He's got it in for all Americans, and especially for El Orobo Ranch. You know he beat off a raid of his about 6 months ago, killed about half a dozen of his men, and he won't never forgive that. Villa can't spare a big enough force to give a safe escort to the border, and he can't assure the safety of our train service. It looks mighty bad, sir. I don't see what in hell you came for." "Neither do I, Grayson," agreed the boss, "but I'm here and we've got to make the best of this. All this may blow over. It has before, and we'll laugh at our fears in a few weeks. This thing that's happening now won't never blow over till the stars and stripes blow over Chihuahua," said Grayson with finality. A few moments later Bridge returned to the office, having unsaddled his pony and turned it to the pasture. "What's your name?" asked Grayson, preparing to enter it in the time book. "Bridge," replied the new bookkeeper. "Initials?" snapped Grayson. Bridge hesitated. "Oh, put me down as L. Bridge," he said. "Where from?" asked the ranch foreman. "El Orobo Ranch," answered Bridge. Grayson shot a quick look at the man. The answer confirmed his suspicions that the stranger was probably a horse thief, which, in Grayson's estimation, was the worst thing a man could be. "Where'd you get that pony you came in on?" he demanded. "I ain't sayin' nothin', of course, but I just want to tell you that we ain't got no use for horse thieves here." The Easterner, who had been listening, was shocked by the brutality of Grayson's speech, but Bridge only laughed. "If you must know, I never bought that horse, and the man he belonged to didn't give it to me. I just took it." "You got your nerve," growled Grayson. "I guess you better get out. We don't want no horse thieves here." "Wait," interposed the boss. "This man doesn't act like a horse thief. A horse thief, I should imagine, would scarcely admit his guilt. Let's have his story before we judge him." "All right," said Grayson, "but he just admitted he stole the horse." Bridge turned to the boss. "Thanks," he said, "but really I did steal the horse." Grayson made a gesture which said, "See, I told you so." "It was like this," went on Bridge. "The gentleman who owned the horse, together with some of his friends, had been shooting at me and my friends. When it was all over there was no one left to inform us who were the legal heirs of the late owners of this and several other horses which were left upon our hands. So I borrowed this one. The law would say, doubtless, that I had stolen it, but I am perfectly willing to return it to the rightful owners if someone will find them for me." "You been in the scrap?" asked Grayson. "Who with?" "A party of Peseda's men," replied Bridge. "When?" "Yesterday." "You see they are working pretty close," said Grayson to his employer, and then to Bridge. "Well, if you took the cayuse from one of Peseda's bunch you can't call that stealing. Your room's in there, back of the office, and you'll find some clothes there that the last man forgot to take with him. You can have them, and from the looks of yours you need them." "Thank you," replied Bridge. "My clothes are a bit rusty. I shall have to speak to James about them," and he passed through into the little bedroom off the office and closed the door behind him. "James?" grunted Grayson. "Who the devil does he mean by James? I ain't seen but one of 'em." The boss was laughing quietly. "The man's a character," he said. "He'll be worth all you pay him, if you can appreciate him, which I doubt, Grayson." "I can appreciate him if he can keep books," replied Grayson. "That's all I ask of him." When Bridge emerged from the bedroom he was clothed in white duck trousers, a soft shirt, and a pair of tennis shoes, and such a change had they wrought in his appearance that neither Grayson nor his employer would have known him had they not seen him come from the room into which he had just sent him to make an exchange of clothing. "Feel better?" asked the boss, smiling. "Clothes are but an incident with me," replied Bridge. "I wear them because it is easier to do so than it would be to dodge the weather and the police. Whatever I may have upon my back affects in no way what I have within my head. No, I cannot say that I feel any better, since these clothes are not as comfortable as my old ones. However, if it pleases Mr. Grayson that I should wear a pink kimono while working for him, I shall gladly wear a pink kimono. What shall I do first?" The question was directed toward Grayson. "Sit down here and see what you can make of this bunch of trouble," replied the foreman. "I'll talk with you again this evening." As Grayson and his employer quitted the office and walked together toward the corrals, the latter's brow was corrugated by thought, and his facial expression that of one who labors to fasten upon a baffling and elusive recollection. "It beats all, Grayson," he said presently, "but I am sure that I have known this new bookkeeper of yours before. The moment he came out of that room dressed like a human being I knew that I had known him. But for the life of me I can't place him. I should be willing to wager considerable, however, that his name is not Bridge." "'Spect you're right," assented Grayson. "He's probably one of them Eastern dude bank clerks that's gone wrong and come down here to hide. Mighty fine place to hide just now, too. And speaking of banks," he went on, "what'll I do 'bout sending over to Cuivaca for the pay tomorrow? Next day's pay day. I don't like to send this here bum. I can't trust the greaser no better, and I can't spare none of my white men that I can trust." "Send him with a couple of the most trustworthy Mexicans you have," suggested the boss. "There ain't no such critter," replied Grayson, "but I guess it's the best I can do. I'll send him along with Tony and Benito. They hate each other too much to frame up anything together, and they both hate a gringo. I reckon they'll have a lovely trip." "But they'll get back with the money, eh?" queried the boss. "If Peseda don't get 'em," replied Grayson. Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Return of the Mucker by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Joe Denoya, Somerset, New Jersey. Billy cracks a safe. Billy Byrne, captain, rode into Cuivaca from the south. He had made a wide detour in order to accomplish this, but under the circumstances he had thought it wise to do so. In his pocket was a safe conduct from one of Villa's generals farther south, a safe conduct taken by Peseda from the body of one of the recent victims. It would explain Billy's presence in Cuivaca, since it had been intended to carry its rightful possessor to Juarez and across the border into the United States. He found the military establishment at Cuivaca small and ill commanded. There were soldiers upon the streets, but the only regularly detailed guard was stationed in front of the bank. No one questioned Billy. He did not have to show his safe conduct. This looks easy, thought Billy. A regular skinch. He first attended to his horse, turning him into a public corral, and then sauntered up the street to the bank, which he entered, still unquestioned. Inside he had changed a bill of large denomination which Pesita had given him for the purpose of an excuse to examine the lay of the bank from the inside. Billy took a long time to count the change. All the time his eyes wandered about the interior, while he made mental notes of such salient features as might prove of moment to him later. The money counted, Billy slowly rolled a cigarette. He saw that the bank was roughly divided into two sections by a wire and wood partition. On one side were the customers, on the other the clerks and the teller. The latter sat behind a small wicket through which he received deposits and cashed checks. Back of him, against the wall, stood a large safe of American manufacture. Billy had had business before with similar safes. A doorway in the rear wall led into the yard behind the building. It was closed by a heavy door covered with sheet iron and fastened by several bolts and a thick, strong bar. There were no windows in the rear wall. From that side the bank appeared almost impregnable to silent assault. Inside everything was primitive, and Billy found himself wondering how a week passed without seeing a bank robbery in the town. Possibly the strong rear defenses and the armed guard in front accounted for it. Satisfied with what he had learned, he passed out into the sidewalk and crossed the street to the saloon. Some soldiers and citizens were drinking at little tables in front of the bar. A couple of card games were in progress, and through the open rear doorway Billy saw a little gathering encircling a cockfight. In none of these things was Billy interested. What he had wished in entering the saloon was merely an excuse to place himself upon the opposite side of the street from the bank, that he might inspect the front from the outside without arousing suspicion. Having purchased and drunk a bottle of poor beer, the temperature of which had probably never been below 80 since it left the bottling department of the Texas brewery which inflicted it upon the ignorant, he sauntered to the front window and looked out. There he saw that the bank building was a two-story affair, the entrance to the second story being at the left side of the first floor, opening directly onto the sidewalk in full view of the sentry who paced to and fro before the structure. Billy wondered what the second floor was utilized for. He saw soiled hangings at the window which aroused a hope and a sudden inspiration. There was a sign above the entrance to the second floor, but Billy's knowledge of the language had not progressed sufficiently to permit him to translate it. Although he had his suspicions as to its meaning, he would learn if his guess was correct. Returning to the bar, he ordered another bottle of beer. As he drank it, he practiced upon the bartender some of his recently acquired Spanish, and learned, though not without considerable difficulty, that he might find lodgings for the night upon the second floor of the bank building. Much elated, Billy left the saloon and walked along the street until he came to the one general store of the town. After another heart-rending scrimmage with the language of Ferdinand and Isabella, he succeeded in making several purchases: 2 heavy sacks, a brace, 2 bits, and a keyhole saw. Placing the tools in one of the sacks, he wrapped the whole in the second sack and made his way back to the bank building. Upon the second floor he found the proprietor of the rooming house and engaged a room in the rear of the building, overlooking the yard. The layout was eminently satisfactory to Captain Byrne, and it was with a feeling of great satisfaction that he descended and sought a restaurant. He had been sent by Pesita merely to look over the ground and the defenses of the town, that the outlaw might later ride in with his entire force and loot the bank. But Billy Byrne, out of his past experience in such matters, had evolved a much simpler plan for separating the enemy from his wealth. Having eaten, Billy returned to his room. It was now dark, and the bank, closed and unlighted, showed all that had left it. Only the sentry paced up and down the sidewalk in front. Going at once to his room, Billy withdrew his tools from their hiding place beneath the mattress, and a moment later was busily engaged in boring holes through the floor at the foot of the bed. For an hour he worked, cautiously and quietly, until he had a rough circle of holes enclosing a space of about 2 feet in diameter. Then he laid aside the brace and bit, and took the keyhole saw, which he patiently sawed through the wood between contiguous holes until the circle completed. He lifted out a section of the floor, leaving an aperture large enough to permit him to squeeze his body through when the time arrived for him to pass into the bank beneath. While Billy had worked, 3 men had ridden into Cuavaca. They were Tony, Benito, and the new bookkeeper of El Robo Rancho. The Mexicans, after eating, repaired at once to the joys of the cantina, while Bridge sought a room in the building to which his escort directed him. As chance would have it, it was the same building in which Billy labored, and the room lay upon the rear side of it, overlooking the same yard. But Bridge did not lie awake to inspect his surroundings. For years he had not ridden as many miles as he had during the past 2 days, so that long unused muscles cried out for rest and relaxation. As a result, Bridge was asleep almost as soon as his head touched the pillow, and so profound was his slumber that it seemed that nothing short of convulsion of nature would arouse him. As Bridge lay down upon his bed, Billy Byrne left his room and descended to the street. The sentry before the bank paid no attention to him, and Billy passed along, unhindered, to the corral where he had left his horse. Here, as he was saddling the animal, he was accosted, much to his disgust, by the proprietor. In broken English the man expressed surprise that Billy rode out so late at night, and the American thought that he detected something more than curiosity in the other's manner and tone, suspicion of the strange gringo. It would never do to leave the fellow in that state of mind, and so Billy leaned close to the other's ear, and with a broad grin and a wink whispered, "Senorita," and jerked his thumb toward the south. "I'll be back by morning," he said. The Mexican's manner altered at once. He laughed and nodded, knowingly, and poked Billy in the ribs. Then he watched him mount and ride out of the corral toward the south, which was also in the direction of the bank, to the rear of which Billy rode without effort to conceal his movements. There he dismounted and left his horse standing with the bridle reins dragging upon the ground, while he removed the lariat from the pommel of the saddle, and, stuffing it inside his shirt, walked back to the street on which the building stood, and so made his way past the sentry to his room. Here he pushed back the bed which he had drawn over the hole in the floor, dropped his 2 sacks through into the bank, and tying the brace to one end of the lariat, lowered it through after the sacks. Looping the middle of the lariat over a bedpost, Billy grasped both strands firmly and lowered himself through the aperture into the room beneath. He had made no more noise in his descent than he had made upon other similar occasions in his past life, when he had practiced the gentle art of porch climbing along Ashland Avenue and Washington Boulevard. Having gained the floor, he pulled upon one end of the lariat until he had drawn it free of the bedpost above, when it fell into his waiting hands. Coiling it carefully, Billy placed it around his neck and under one arm. Billy, acting as a professional, was a careful and methodical man. He always saw that every little detail was properly attended to before he went to the next phase of his endeavors. Because of this ingrained caution, Billy had long since secured the tops of the 2 sacks together, leaving only a sufficient opening to permit of their each being filled without delay or inconvenience. Now he turned his attention to the rear door. The bar and bolts were easily shot from their seats from inside, and Billy saw to it that this was attended to before he went further with his labors. It were well to have one's retreat assured at the earliest possible moment. A single bolt Billy left in place that he might not be surprised by an intruder, but first he had tested it and discovered it could be drawn with ease. These matters satisfactorily attended to, Billy assaulted the combination knob of the safe with a metal bit which he had inserted in the brace before lowering it into the bank. The work was hard and progressed slowly. It was necessary to withdraw the bit often and lubricate it with a piece of soap which Billy had brought along in his pocket for the purpose. But eventually a hole was bored through into the tumblers of the combination lock. From without, Billy could hear the footsteps of the sentry passing back and forth within 50 feet of him, all unconscious that the bank he was guarding was being looted almost beneath his eyes. Once a corporal came with another soldier and relieved the sentry. After that Billy heard the footfalls no longer, for the new sentry was barefoot. The boring finished, Billy drew a piece of wire from an inside pocket and inserted it into the hole. Then, working the wire with accustomed fingers, he turned the combination knob this way and that, feeling with the bit of wire until the tumblers should all be in line. This, too, was slow work, but it was infinitely less liable to attract attention than any other method of safe cracking with which Billy was familiar. It was long past midnight when Captain Byrne was rewarded with success. The tumblers clicked into position, the handle of the safe door turned, and the bolts slipped back. To swing open the door and transfer the contents of the safe to the 2 sacks was the work of but a few minutes. As Billy rose and threw the heavy burden across his shoulder, he heard a challenge from without, and then a parley. Immediately after the sound of footsteps ascending the stairway to the rooming house came plainly to his ears, and then he had slipped the last bolt upon the rear door and was out into the yard beyond. Now Bridge, sleeping the sleep of utter exhaustion that the boom of a cannon might not have disturbed, did that inexplicable thing which every one of us has done 100 times in our lives. He awakened, with a start, out of a sound sleep, though no disturbing noise had reached his ears. Something impelled him to sit up in bed, and as he did so he could see through the window beside him into the yard and into the rear of the building. There in the moonlight he saw a man throwing a sack across a horn of a saddle. He saw the man mount, and he saw him wheel his horse around about and ride away toward the north. There seemed to Bridge nothing unusual about the man's act, nor had there been any indication either of stealth or haste to arouse the American's suspicions. Bridge lay back again upon his pillows and sought to woo the slumber which this sudden awakening seemed to have banished for the remainder of the night. And up the stairway to the second floor staggered Tony and Benito. Their money was gone, but they had acquired something else which appeared much more difficult to carry and not so easily gotten rid of. Tony held the key to the room. It was the second room upon the right of the hall. Tony remembered that very distinctly. He had impressed it upon his mind before leaving the room earlier in the evening, for Tony had feared some such contingency as that which had befallen. Tony fumbled with the handle of the door, and stabbed vainly at the elusive keyhole. "Wait," mumbled Benito. "This is not the room. It was the second door from the stairway, and this is the third." Tony lurched about and staggered back. Tony reasoned, if that was the third door, the next behind me must be the second, and on the right. But Tony took not into consideration that he had reversed the direction of his erratic wobbling. He lunged across the hall, not because he wished to, but because the spirits moved him. He came in contact with the door. This, then, must be the second door, he soliloquized, and it is upon my right. Ah, Benito, this is the room. Benito was skeptical. He said as much, but Tony was obdurate. Did he not know a second door when he saw one? Was he, furthermore, not a grown man, and therefore entirely capable of distinguishing between his left hand and his right? Yes, Tony was all of that, and more, so Tony inserted the key in the lock. It would have turned any lock upon the second floor, and lo, the door swung inward upon its hinges. "Ah, Benito," cried Tony, "did I not tell you? See, this is our room, for the key opens the door." The room was dark. Tony, carried forward by the weight of his head, which had long since grown unaccountably heavy, rushed his feet rapidly forward that he might keep them within a few inches of his center of equilibrium. The distance which it took his feet to catch up to his head was equal to the distance between the doorway and the foot of the bed, and when Tony reached that spot, with Benito meandering after him, the latter, much to his astonishment, saw in the diffused moonlight which pervaded the room the miraculous disappearance of his former enemy and erstwhile friend. Then from the depths below came a wild scream and a heavy thud. The sentry upon the beat before the bank heard both. For an instant he stood motionless, then he called aloud for a guard, and turned toward the bank door, but this was locked, and he could but peer in through the windows. Seeing a dark form within, and being a Mexican, he raised his rifle and fired through the glass of the doors. Tony, who had dropped through the hole which Billy had used so quietly, heard the zing of the bullet pass his head, and the impact of it splashed into the adobe wall behind him. With a second yell, Tony dodged behind the safe and besought Mary to protect him. From above, Benito peered through the hole into the blackness below. Down the hall came the barefoot landlord, awakened by the screams and the shot. Behind him came Bridge, buckling his revolver belt around his hips as he ran. Not having been furnished with pajamas, Bridge had not thought it necessary to remove his clothing, and so he had lost no time in dressing. When the two, now joined by Benito, reached the street, they found the guard there, battering in the bank doors. Benito, fearing for the life of Tony, which if anyone took should be taken by him, rushed upon the sergeant of the guards, explaining with both his lips and hands the remarkable accident which had precipitated Tony into the bank. The sergeant listened, though he did not believe, and when the doors had fallen in he commanded Tony to come out with his hands above his head. Then followed an investigation which disclosed the looting of the safe, and the great hole in the ceiling which through Tony had tumbled. The bank president came while the sergeant and the landlord were in Billy's room investigating. Bridge had followed them. "It was the gringo," cried the excited Boniface. "This is his room. He has cut a hole in my floor, which I shall have to pay to have repaired." The captain came next, sleepy-eyed and profane. When he heard what had happened, and that the wealth with which he had been detailed to guard had been taken while he slept, he tore his hair, and promised that the sentry should be shot at dawn. By the time they had returned to the street, all the male population of Cuervaca was there, and most of the female. $1,000, cried the bank president, to the man who stops the thief and returns to me what the villain has stolen. A detachment of soldiers was in the saddle and passing the bank as the offer was made. "Which way did he go?" asked the captain. "Did no one see him leave?" Bridge was upon the point of saying that he had seen him, and that he had ridden north, when it occurred to him that $1,000, even $1,000 Mex, was a great deal of money, and that it would carry both himself and Billy to Rio, and leave something for pleasure beside. Then up spoke a tall, thin man with the skin of a coffee bean. "I saw him, Senor Captain," he cried. "He kept his horse in my corral, and at night he came and took it out saying he was riding to visit the senorita. He fooled me, the scoundrel. But I'll tell you, he rode south. I saw him ride south with my own eyes." "Then we shall have him before morning," cried the captain, "for there is one place to the south where a robber would ride, and he has not had sufficient start of us that he can reach safely before we overhaul him. Forward, march!" And the detachment moved down the narrow street. "Trot, march!" And as they passed the store, "Gallop, march!" Bridge almost ran the length of the street to the corral. His pony must be rested by now, and a few miles to the north the gringo whose capture meant $1,000 to Bridge was on the road to liberty. "I hate to do it," thought Bridge, "because, even if he is a bank robber, he's an American. But I need the money, and in all probability the fellow is a scoundrel who should have been hanged long ago." Over the trail to the north rode Captain Billy Byrne, secure in the belief that no pursuit would develop until after the opening hour of the bank in the morning, by which time he would be halfway to his return journey to Peseta's camp. Old man Peseta would be surprised when I show him what I got for him, mused Billy. Say, he exclaimed, suddenly and aloud, why the devil should I take all this swag back to the yellow-faced yegg? Who pulled the thing off anyway? Why me, of course. And does anybody think Billy Byrne's boob enough to split with a guy that didn't have a hand in it at all? Split? Why didn't Nuttall take it all? Nix. Me for the border. I couldn't do a thing with all this coin down in Rio, and Bridge'll be along there most of the time. We can hit it up some in little old Rio on this bunch of dough. Why, say, kid, there must be $1 million here for the weight of it. A frown suddenly clouded his face. Why did I take it? He asked himself. Was I cracking a safe, or was I pulling off something for poor old bleeding Mexico? If I was a-doing that, there ain't nothing criminal in what I done, except to the guy that owned the coin. If I was just plain cracking a safe on my own hook, why then I'm a crook again, and I can't be that. No, not with the face of yours standing out there so plain right in front of me, just as though you were there yourself, asking me to remember and be decent. God. Barbara, why wasn't I born for the likes of you, and not just a measly ordinary mucker like I am? Ah, hell, what is that Bridge sings of Nibs? There ain't no sweet Penelope somewhere that's longing much for me, but I can smell the blundering sea and hearing the rigging hum, and I can hear the whispering lips that fly before the outbound ships, and I can hear the breakers of the sand a-calling, come. Billy took off his hat and scratched his head. Funny, he thought, how a girl and poetry can get on a tough nut like me. I wonder what the guys that used to hang out in back of Kelly's would say if they seen what was going through my being just now. They'd call me Lizzie, eh? Well, they wouldn't call me Liz more than once. I may be getting soft in the head, but I'm all to the good with my dukes. Speed is not conducive to sentimental thoughts, and so Billy had unconsciously permitted his pony to drop into a lazy walk. There was no need for haste anyway. No one knew yet that the bank had been robbed, or at least so Billy argued. He might, however, have thought differently upon the subject of haste, could he have had a glimpse of the horseman in his rear, 2 miles behind him now, but rapidly closing up the distance at a keen gallop, while he strained his eyes across the moonlit flat ahead in eager search for his quarry. So absorbed was Billy Byrne in his reflections that his ears were deaf to the pounding of the hoofs of the pursuer's horse upon the soft dust of the dry road until Bridge was little more than 100 yards from him. For the last half-mile Bridge had had the figure of the fugitive in full view, and his mind had been playing rapidly with seductive visions of $1,000 reward. $1,000 Mex, perhaps, but still quite enough to excite pleasant thoughts. At the first glimpse of the horseman ahead, Bridge had reined his mount down to a trot, that the noise of his approach might thereby be lessened. He had drawn his revolver from its holster, and was upon the point of putting spurs to his horse for the sudden dash upon the fugitive, when the man ahead, finally attracted to the noise of the other's approach, turned in his saddle and saw him. Neither recognized the other, and at Bridge's command of "Hands up!" Billy, lightning-like in his quickness, drew and fired. The bullet raked Bridge's hat from his head, but left him unscathed. Billy had wheeled his pony around until he stood broadside toward Bridge. The latter had fired scarce a second after Billy's shot had pinged so perilously close, fired at a perfect target, but 50 yards away. At the sound of the report, the robber's horse reared and plunged, then, wheeling and tottering high upon its hind feet, fell backwards. Billy, realizing that his mount had been hit, tried to throw himself from the saddle, but until the very moment that the beast toppled over, the man was held by his cartridge belt, which, as the animal first lunged, had caught over the high horn of the Mexican saddle. The belt slipped from the horn as the horse was falling, and Billy succeeded in throwing himself a little to one side. One leg, however, was pinned beneath the animal's body, and the force of the fall jarred the revolver from Billy's hand, to drop just beyond his reach. His carbine was in his boot at the horse's side, and the animal was lying upon it. Instantly Bridge rode to his side and covered him with his revolver. "Don't move," he commanded, "or I'll be under the painful necessity of terminating your earthly endeavors right here and now." "Well, for the love of Mike," cried the fallen bandit. "You!" Bridge was off his horse the instant that familiar voice sounded in his ears. "Billy?" he exclaimed. "Why, Billy, was it you that robbed the bank?" Even as he spoke, Bridge was busy easing the weight of the dead pony from Billy's leg. "Anything broken?" he asked, as the bandit struggled to free himself. "Not so's you can notice it," replied Billy, and a moment later he was on his feet. "Say, Bo," he added, "it's a mighty good thing you dropped little Pinto here, for I'd a sure got you the next shot. Gee, it makes me sweat to think of it. But about this bank robbing business. You can't exactly say that I robbed a bank. That money was the enemy's resources, and I just nicked their resources. That's war. That ain't robbery. I ain't taking it for myself. It's for the cause of poor bleeding Mexico, and Billy grinned a large grin. "You took it for Peseta?" asked Bridge. "Of course," replied Billy. "I won't get a jitney of it. I won't take none of it, Bridge. Honest, I'm on the square now." "I know you are, Billy," replied the other, "but if you're caught you might find it difficult to convince the authorities of your high-mindedness and your disinterestedness." "Authorities!" scoffed Billy. "There ain't no authorities in Mexico. One bandit is just as good as the other, and from Peseta to Carranza they're all bandits at heart. There ain't a one of them that gives two whoops in hell for poor bleedin' Mexico, unless they can do the bleedin' themselves. It's dog eat dog here, and if they caught me they'd shoot me whether I'd robbed the bank or not. What's that?" Billy was suddenly alert, straining his eyes back in the direction of Cuivaca. "They're coming, Billy," said Bridge. "Take my horse, quick. You must get out of here in a hurry. The whole post is searching for you. I thought that they went toward the south. Some of them must have circled." "What'll you do if I take your horse?" asked Billy. "I can walk back," said Bridge. "It isn't far to town. I'll tell them I have come only a short distance when my horse threw me and ran away. They'll believe it, for they think I'm a rotten horseman. The two vaqueros who escorted me to town, I mean." Billy hesitated. "I hate to do it, Bridge," he said. "You must, Billy," urged the other. "If they find us here together it'll merely mean that the two of us will get it. For I'll stick with you, Billy, and we can't fight off a whole troop of cavalry out here in the open. If you take my horse we can both get out of it, and later I'll see you in Rio. Goodbye, Billy. I'm off for town." And Bridge turned and started back along the road on foot. Billy watched him in silence for the moment. The truth of Bridge's statement of fact was so apparent that Billy was forced to accept the plan. A moment later he transferred the bags of loot to Bridge's pony, swung onto the saddle, and took a last backward look at the diminishing figure of the man swinging along in the direction of Cuivaca. "Say," he muttered to himself, "but you're a right one, Bo." And wheeling to the north he clapped his spurs to his new mount and loped easily off into the night. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Return of the Mucker by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Joe DeNoia, Somerset, New Jersey. Barbara releases a conspirator. It was a week later, yet Grayson was still growling about the loss of "that there Brazos pony." Grayson, the boss, and the boss's daughter were sitting upon the veranda of the ranch house when the foreman reverted to the subject. "I knew I didn't have no business hiring a man that can't ride," he said. "Why, that there Brazos pony never did stumble, and if he'd have stumbled he'd have stood around a year waiting to be caught up again. I just can't figure it out no ways how that there tenderfoot bookkeeper lost him. He must have shooed him away with a stick, and saddle and bridle and all gone too. Doggone it." "I'm the one who should be peeved," spoke up the girl with a wry smile. "Brazos was my pony. He's the one you picked out for me to ride while I am here. But I'm sure poor Mr. Bridge feels as badly about it as anyone, and I know that he couldn't help it. We shouldn't be too hard on him. We might just as well attempt to hold him responsible for the looting of the bank and the loss of the payroll money." "Well," said Grayson, "I gave him that horse 'cause I knew he couldn't ride it, and that was the safest in the cavy. I wished I'd give him Santa Anna instead. I wouldn't mind losing him. There won't no one ride him anyhow. He's that ornery." "The thing that surprises me the most," remarked the boss, "is that Brazos doesn't come back. He was foaled on this range. He's never been ridden anywhere else, has he?" "He was foaled right here on this ranch," Grayson corrected him, "and he ain't never been more'n 100 miles from it. If he ain't dead or stolen he'd have been back afore bookkeeper was. It's almighty queer." "What sort of bookkeeper is Mr. Bridge?" asked the girl. "Oh, he's all right, I guess," replied Grayson grudgingly. "A feller's got to be some good at something. He's probably one of these here paper collar, cracker fed college dudes that don't know nothing 'cept writing in books." The girl rose, smiled, and moved away. "I like Mr. Bridge anyhow," she called back over her shoulder. "For whatever he may not be he is certainly a well-bred gentleman," which speech did not tend to raise Mr. Bridge in the estimation of the hard-fisted ranch foreman. "Funny them greasers don't come in from the north range with that bunch of steers. They've been gone all day now," he said to the boss, ignoring the girl's parting sally. Bridge sat tip-tilted against the front of the office building, reading an ancient magazine which he had found within. His day's work was done, and he was but waiting for the gang that would call him in to the evening meal with the other employees of the ranch. The magazine failed to rouse his interest. He let it drop idly to his knees, and with eyes closed reverted to his never-failing source of entertainment. "And that there slim, poetic guy, he turned and looked me in the eye. It's overland and overseas to where? Most anywhere that isn't here," I says. His face went kinda queer. "This place we're in is always here, the other place is there." Bridge stretched luxuriously. "There," he repeated. "I've been searching for there for many years, but for some reason I can never get away from here. About 2 weeks of any place on earth, and that place is just plain here to me. and I'm longing once again for there. His musings were interrupted by a sweet feminine voice close by. Bridge did not open his eyes at once. He just sat there listening. As I was hiking past the woods, the cool and sleepy summer woods, I saw a guy talking to the sunshine in the air. Thinks I, he's going to have a fit. I'll stick around and watch a bit. But he paid no attention, hardly knowing I was there. Then the girl broke into a merry laugh, and Bridge opened his eyes and came to his feet. I didn't know you cared for that sort of stuff, he said. Nibs writes man verse. I shouldn't have imagined that it would appeal to you, young lady. But it does, though, she replied, at least to me. There's a swing to it and a freedom that gets me in the eye. Again she laughed, and when this girl laughed, hard-headed and much older men like Mr. L. Bridge felt strange emotions move within their breasts. For a week, Barbara had seen a great deal of the new bookkeeper. Aside from her father, he was the only man of culture and refinement of which the rancho could boast, or, as the rancho would have put it, be ashamed of. She had often sought the veranda of the little office and lured the bookkeeper from his work, and on several occasions had had him at the ranch house. Not only was he an interesting talker, but there was an element of mystery about him which appealed to the girl's sense of romance. She knew that he was a gentleman born and reared, and she had often found herself wondering what tragic train of circumstances had set him adrift among the flotsam of humanity's wreckage. Too, the same persistent conviction that she had known him somewhere in the past that possessed her father clung to her mind, and she could not place him. I overheard your dissertation of here and there, said the girl. I could not very well help it. It would have been rude to interrupt the conversation. Her eyes sparkled mischievously, and her cheeks dimpled. You wouldn't have been interrupting a conversation, objected Bridge, smiling. You would have been turning a monologue into a conversation. But it was a conversation, insisted the girl. The wanderer was conversing with the bookkeeper. You are a victim of wanderlust, Mr. L. Bridge. Don't deny it. You hate bookkeeping, or any other such prosaic vocation as requires permanent residence in one place. Come now, expostulated the man. That is hardly fair. Haven't I been here a whole week? They both laughed. What in the world could have induced you to remain so long? Cried Barbara. How very much like an old-timer you must feel, one of the oldest inhabitants. I'm a regular aborigine, declared Bridge, but his heart would have chosen another reply. It would have been glad to tell the girl that there was a real reason and a very growing inducement to remain in El Orobo Rancho. The man was too self-controlled, however, to give way to the impulses of his heart. At first he had just liked the girl, and been immensely glad of her companionship because there was so much that was common to them both, a love for good music, good pictures, and good literature, things Bridge hadn't had an opportunity to discuss with another for a long, long time. And slowly he had found delight in just sitting and looking at her. He was experienced enough to realize that this was a dangerous symptom, and so from the moment that he had been forced to acknowledge it to himself, he had been very careful to guard his speech and his manner in the girl's presence. He found pleasure in dreaming of what might have been, as he sat watching the girl's changing expression as different moods possessed her. But as for permitting a hope, even, of realization of his dreams, he was far too practical for that, dreamer though he was. As the two talked, Grayson passed, his rather stern face clouded as he saw the girl and the new bookkeeper laughing there together. Ain't you got nothing to do? He asked Bridge. Yes, indeed, replied the latter. Then why don't you do it? Snapped Grayson. I am, said Bridge. Mr. Bridge is entertaining me, interrupted the girl, before Grayson could make any rejoinder. It is my fault. I took him from his work. You don't mind, do you, Mr. Grayson? Grayson mumbled an inarticulate reply and went his way. Mr. Grayson does not seem particularly enthusiastic about me, laughed Bridge. No, replied the girl candidly, but I think it's just because you can't ride. Can't ride? Ejaculated Bridge. Why, haven't I been riding ever since I came here? Mr. Grayson doesn't consider anything in the way of equestrianism riding, unless the ridden is perpetually seeking the life of the rider, explained Barbara. Just at present he is terribly put out because you lost Brazos. He said Brazos never stumbled in his life, and even if you had fallen from his back, he would have stood beside you, waiting for you to remount him. You see, he was the kindest horse on the ranch, especially picked for me to ride. However in the world did you lose him, Mr. Bridge? The girl was looking full at the man as she propounded her query. Bridge was silent. A faint flush overspread his face. He had not before known that the horse was hers. He couldn't very well tell her the truth, and he wouldn't lie to her, so he made no reply. Barbara saw the flush and noted the man's silence. For the first time her suspicions were aroused, yet she would not believe that this gentle, amiable drifter could be guilty of any crime greater than negligence or carelessness. But why his evident embarrassment now? The girl was mystified. For a moment or two they sat in silence. Then Barbara rose. I must run along back now, she explained. Papa will be wondering what has become of me. Yes, said Bridge, and let her go. He would have been glad to tell her the truth, but he couldn't do that without betraying Billy. He had heard enough to know that Francisco Villa had been so angered over the bold looting of the bank in the face of the company of his own soldiers that he would stop at nothing to secure the person of the thief once his identity was known. Bridge was perfectly satisfied with the ethics of his own act on the night of the bank robbery. He knew that the girl would have applauded him, and that Grayson himself would have done what Bridge did had a like emergency confronted the ranch foreman. But to have admitted complicity in the escape of the fugitive would have been to have exposed himself to the wrath of Villa, and at the same time revealed the identity of the thief. Nor, thought Bridge, would he get Brazos back for Barbara. It was after dark when the vaqueros Grayson had sent to the north range returned to the ranch. They came empty-handed and slowly, for one of them supported a wounded comrade on the saddle before him. They rode directly to the office where Grayson and Bridge were going over some of the business of the day, and when the former saw them, his brow clouded, for he knew, before he had heard their story, what had happened. "Who done it?" he asked, as the men filed into the office, half carrying the wounded man. "Some of Peseta's followers," replied Benito. "Did they get the steers too?" inquired Grayson. "Part of them. We drove off most and scattered them. We saw the Brazos pony too," and Benito looked from beneath heavy lashes in the direction of the bookkeeper. "Where?" asked Grayson. "One of Peseta's officers rode him, an Americano. Tony and I saw the same man in Cuavaca the night the bank was robbed, and today he was riding the Brazos pony." Again the dark eyes turned toward Bridge. Grayson was quick to catch the significance of the Mexican's meaning, the more so as it was directly in line with the suspicions which he himself had been nursing since the robbery. During the colloquy the boss entered the office. He had heard the returning vaqueros ride into the ranch, and noting that they brought no steers with them, had come to the office to hear their story. Barbara, spurred by curiosity, accompanied her father. "You heard what Benito says?" asked Grayson, turning toward his employer. The latter nodded. All eyes were upon Bridge. "Well," snapped Grayson, "what you got to say for yourself? I've been suspecting you right along. I knew derned well that there Brazos pony never run off by itself. You and that other crook from the States framed this whole thing up pretty slick, didn't you?" "Well, we'll " "Wait a minute, Grayson," interrupted the boss. "Give Mr. Bridge a chance to explain. You're making a rather serious charge against him without any particular strong proof to back your accusation." "Oh, that's all right," exclaimed Bridge with a smile. "I have known that Mr. Grayson suspected me of implication in the robbery, but who can blame him? A man who can't ride may be guilty of almost anything." Grayson sniffed. Barbara took a step nearer Bridge. She had been ready to doubt him himself only an hour or so ago, but that was before he had been accused. Now that she found others arrayed against him, her impulses were to come to his defense. "You didn't do it, did you, Mr. Bridge?" Her tone was almost pleading. "If you mean robbing the bank," he replied, "I did not, Miss Barbara. I knew no more about it until after it was over than Benito or Tony. In fact, they were the ones who discovered it while I was still asleep in my room above the bank." "Well, how did the robber get that there Brazos pony then?" demanded Grayson savagely. "That's what I want to know." "You'll have to ask him, Mr. Grayson," replied Bridge. "Villa'd ask him when he gets hold of him," snapped Grayson, "but I reckon he'll get all the information out of you that he wants first. He'll be in Cuavaca tomorrow, and so will you." "You mean that you're going to turn me over to General Villa?" asked Bridge. "You're going to turn an American over to that butcher, knowing that he'll be shot inside of 24 hours?" "Shooting's too damn good for a horse thief," replied Grayson. Barbara turned impulsively toward her father. "You won't let Mr. Grayson do that?" she asked. "Mr. Grayson knows best how to handle such affairs as this, Barbara," replied her father. "He is my superintendent, and I have made it a point never to interfere with him." "You will let Mr. Bridge be shot without making an effort to save him?" she demanded. "We do not know that he will be shot," replied the ranch owner. "If he is innocent there is no reason why he should be punished. If he is guilty of implication in the Cuavaca bank robbery he deserves, according to the rules of war, to die, for General Villa, I am told, considers that a treasonable act. Some of the funds upon which his government depends for munitions of war were there. They were stolen and turned over to the enemies of Mexico." "If we interfere we'll turn Villa against us," interposed Grayson. "He ain't any too keen for Americans as it is." "Well, if this fellow was my brother I'd have to turn him over to the authorities." "Well, I thank God," exclaimed Bridge fervently, "that in addition to being shot by Villa I don't have to endure the added disgrace of being related to you, and I'm not so sure that I should be hanged by Villa." And with that he wiped the oil lamp from the table against which he had been leaning and leaped across the room for the doorway. Barbara and her father had been standing nearest the exit, and as the girl realized the bold break for liberty the man was making, she pushed her father to one side and threw open the door. Bridge was through it in an instant with a parting "God bless you, little girl" as he passed her. Then the door was closed with a bang. Barbara turned the key, withdrew it from the lock, and threw it across the darkened room. Grayson and the unwounded Mexicans leapt after the fugitive only to find their way barred by the locked door. Outside, Bridge ran to the horses standing patiently with lowered heads awaiting the return of their masters. In an instant he was astride one of them, and lashing the others ahead of him with a quirt he spurred away into the night. By the time Grayson and the Mexicans had wormed their way through one of the small windows of the office, the new bookkeeper was beyond sight and earshot. As the ranch foreman was saddling up with several of his men in the corral to give chase to the fugitive, the boss strolled in and touched him on the arm. "Mr. Grayson," he said, "I have made it a point never to interfere with you, but I'm going to ask you now not to pursue Mr. Bridge. I shall be glad if he makes good his escape. Barbara was right. He is a fellow American. We cannot turn him over to Villa, or any other Mexican to be murdered." Grumblingly, Grayson unsaddled. "If you've seen what I've seen around here," he said, "I guess you wouldn't be so keen to save this feller's hide." "What do you mean?" asked the boss. "I mean he's been trying to make love to your daughter." The older man laughed. "Don't be a fool, Grayson," he said, and walked away. An hour later Barbara was strolling up and down before the ranch house in the cool and refreshing air of the Chihuahua night. Her mind was occupied with disquieting reflections of the past few hours. Her pride was immeasurably hurt by the part impulse had forced her to take in the affair at the office. Not that she regretted that she had connived in the escape of Bridge, but it was humiliating that a girl of her position should have been compelled to play so melodramatic a part before Grayson and his Mexican vaqueros. Then, too, was she disappointed in Bridge. She had looked upon him as a gentleman whose misfortune and wanderlust had reduced to the lowest stratum of society. Now she feared that he belonged to that substratum which lies below the lowest, which society recognizes as a part of itself, and which is composed solely of the criminal class. It was hard for Barbara to realize that she had associated with a thief. Just for a moment it was hard, until recollection forced her upon the unwelcome fact of the status of another whom she had known, to whom she had given her love. The girl did not wince at the thought. Instead she squared her shoulders and raised her chin. "I am proud of him, whatever he may have been," she murmured, but she was not thinking of the new bookkeeper. When she did think again of Bridge it was to be glad that he had escaped, for he is an American, like myself. "Well," exclaimed a voice behind her, "you played us a pretty trick, Miss Barbara." The girl turned to see Grayson approaching. To her surprise he seemed to hold no resentment whatsoever. She greeted him courteously. "I couldn't let you turn an American over to General Villa," she said, "no matter what he had done." "I like your spirit," said the man. "You're the kind of girl I've been looking for all my life. One with nerve and grit, and you got 'em both. You liked that bookkeeper critter, and he wasn't half a man. I like you, and I am a man, if I do say so myself." The girl drew back in astonishment. "Mr. Grayson," she exclaimed, "you are forgetting yourself." "No, I ain't," he cried hoarsely. "I love you, and I'm gonna have you. You'd love me too if you knew me better." He took a step forward and grasped her arm, trying to draw her to him. The girl pushed him away with one hand and with the other struck him across the face. Grayson dropped her arm, and as he did so she drew herself to her full height and looked him straight in the eyes. "You may go now," she said, her voice like ice. "I shall never speak of this to anyone, provided you never attempt to repeat it." He made no reply. The blow in the face had cooled his ardor temporarily, but had it not also served another purpose? To crystallize it into a firm and inexorable resolve. When he had departed, Barbara turned and entered the house. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of The Return of the Mucker by Edgar Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Joe DeNoia, Somerset, New Jersey. Billy to the rescue. It was nearly 10 o'clock the following morning when Barbara, sitting upon the veranda of the ranch house, saw her father approaching from the direction of the office. His face wore a troubled expression which the girl could not but note. "What's the matter, Papa?" she asked, as he sank into a chair at her side. "Your self-sacrifice of last evening was all to no avail," he replied. "Bridge has been captured by Villistas." "What?" cried the girl. "You can't mean it. How did you learn?" "Grayson just had a phone message from Cuernavaca," he explained. "They only repaired the line yesterday since Peseta's men cut it last month. This was our first message, and do you know, Barbara, I can't help feeling sorry. I had hoped that he would get away." "So had I," said the girl. Her father was eyeing her closely to note the effect of the announcement upon her, but he could see no greater concern reflected than that which he himself felt for a fellow man and an American who was doomed to death in the hands of an alien race, far from his own land and his own people. "Can nothing be done?" she asked. "Absolutely," he replied with finality. "I have talked it over with Grayson, and he assures me that an attempt at intervention upon our part might tend to antagonize Villa, in which case we are all as good as lost. He is none too fond of us as it is, and Grayson believes, and not without reason, that he would welcome the slightest pretext for withdrawing the protection of his favor. Instantly he did that we should become the prey of every marauding band that infests the mountains. Not only would Peseta swoop down upon us, but those companies of freebooters which acknowledge nominal loyalty to Villa would be about our ears in no time. No, dear, we may do nothing. The young man has made his bed, and now I am afraid he will have to lie in it alone." For a while the girl sat in silence, and presently her father arose and entered the house. Shortly after she followed him, reappearing soon in riding togs and walking rapidly to the corrals. Here she found an American cowboy busily engaged in whittling a stick as he sat upon an upturned cracker box and shot accurate streams of tobacco juice at a couple of industrious tumblebugs that had had the great impudence to roll their little balls of provender within the whittler's range. "Oh, Eddie!" she cried. The man looked up and was at once electrified into action. He sprang to his feet and whipped off his sombrero. A broad smile illuminated his freckled face. "Yes, miss," he answered. "What can I do for you?" "Saddle a pony for me, Eddie," she explained. "I want to take a little ride." "Sure," he assured her cheerily. "Have it ready in a jiffy," and away he went, uncoiling his riata, toward a little group of saddle ponies which stood in the corral against necessity for instant use. In a couple of minutes he came back leading one, which he tied to the corral bars. "But I can't ride that horse," exclaimed the girl. "He bucks." "Sure," said Eddie. "I'm going to ride him." "Oh, are you going somewhere?" she asked. "I'm a going with you, miss," announced Eddie sheepishly. "But I didn't ask you, Eddie, and I don't want you today," she urged. "Sorry, miss." He threw back over his shoulder and he walked back to rope a second pony. "But them's orders. You're not allowed to ride no place without an escort." "'Twouldn't be safe neither, miss," he almost pleaded, "and I won't hinder you none. I'll ride behind far enough to be there if you need." Directly he came back with another pony, a sad-eyed, gentle-appearing little beast, and commenced saddling and bridling the two. "Will you promise," she asked, after watching him in silence for a time, "that you will tell no one where I go or whom I see?" "Cross my heart, hope to die," he assured her. "All right, Eddie, then I'll let you come with me, and you can ride beside me instead of behind." Across the flat they rode, following the windings of the river road. 1 mile, 2, 5, 10. Eddie had long since been wondering what the purpose of so steady a pace could be. This was no pleasure ride in which took the boss's daughter. Heifer, Eddie would have called her. 10 miles up river at a hard trot. Eddie was worried too. They had passed the danger line, and were well within the stamping grounds of Peseta and his retainers. Here each little adobe dwelling, and they were scattered at intervals of a mile or more along the river, contained a rabid partisan of Peseta, or it contained no one. Peseta had seen to this latter condition personally. At last the young lady drew rein before a squalid and dilapidated hut. Eddie gasped. It was Jose's, and Jose was a notorious scoundrel whom old age alone kept from the active pursuit of the only calling he had ever known, brigandage. Why should the boss's daughter come to Jose? Jose was hand in glove with every cutthroat in Chihuahua, or at least within a radius of 200 miles of his abode. Barbara swung herself from the saddle and handed her bridle reins to Eddie. "Hold him, please," she said. "I'll be gone but a moment." "You're not going in there to see old Jose alone," gasped Eddie. "Why not?" she asked. "If you're afraid you can leave my horse and ride along home." Eddie colored to the roots of his sandy hair and kept silent. The girl approached the doorway of the mean hovel and peered within. At one end sat a bent old man, smoking. He looked up as Barbara's figure darkened the doorway. "Jose," said the girl. The old man rose to his feet and came toward her. "Eh, senorita, eh?" he cackled. "You are Jose?" she asked. "Si, senorita," replied the old Indian. "What can poor old Jose do to serve the beautiful senorita?" "You can carry a message to one of Peseta's officers," replied the girl. "I have heard much about you since I came to Mexico. I know that there is not another man in this part of Chihuahua who may so easily reach Peseta as you." She raised her hand for silence as the Indian would have protested. Then she reached into the pocket of her riding breeches and withdrew a handful of silver which she permitted to trickle tinklingly from one palm to the other. "I wish you to go to the camp of Peseta," she continued, "and carry word to a man who robbed the bank at Cuernavaca. He is an American, that his friend, Senor Bridge, has been captured by Villa and is being held for execution in Cuernavaca. You must go at once. You must get word to Senor Bridge's friend so that help may reach Senor Bridge before dawn. Do you understand?" The Indian nodded assent. "Here," said the girl, "is a payment on account. When I know that you have delivered the message in time you shall have as much more. Will you do it?" "I will try," said the Indian, and stretched forth a claw-like hand for the money. "Good!" exclaimed Barbara. "Now start at once," and she dropped the silver coins in the old man's palm. It was dusk when Captain Billy Byrne was summoned to the tent of Peseta. There he found the weazened old Indian squatting at the side of the outlaw. "Jose," said Peseta, "has word for you." Billy Byrne turned questioningly toward the Indian. "I have been sent, Senor Captain," explained Jose, by the beautiful senorita of El Robo Rancho to tell you that your friend, Senor Bridge, has been captured by General Villa and is being held at Cuervaca, where he will doubtless be shot, if help does not reach him before tomorrow morning." Peseta was looking questioningly at Byrne. Since the gringo had returned from Cuervaca with the loot of the bank and turned the last penny of it over to him, the outlaw had looked upon his new captain as something just short of superhuman. To have robbed the bank thus easily, while Villa's soldiers paced back and forth before the doorway, seemed little short of an indication of miraculous powers, while to have turned the loot over intact to his chief, not asking for so much as a peso of it, was absolutely incredible. Peseta could not understand this man, but he admired him greatly and feared him too. Such a man was worth 100 of the ordinary run of humanity that enlisted beneath Peseta's banners. Byrne had but to ask a favor to have it granted, and now, when he called upon Peseta to furnish him with a suitable force for the rescue of Bridge, the brigand enthusiastically acceded to his demands. "I will come," he exclaimed, "and all my men shall ride with me. We will take Cuervaca by storm. We may even capture Villa himself." "Wait a minute, Bo," interrupted Billy Byrne. "Don't get excited. I'm looking to get my pal out in Cuervaca. After that I don't care who you capture, but I'm going to get Bridgie out first. I can do it with 25 men, if it ain't too late. Then if you want to, you can shoot up the town. Let me have the 25, and you hang around the edges with the rest of them till I'm done. What do you say?" Peseta was willing to agree to anything, and so it came that half an hour later Billy Byrne was leading a choice selection of some 24 cutthroats down through the hills toward Cuervaca, while a couple of miles in the rear followed Peseta with the balance of his band. Billy rode until the few remaining lights of Cuervaca shone but a short distance ahead, and they could hear plainly the strains of a grating graphophone from beyond the open windows of a dance hall, and the voices of the sentries as they called the hour. "Stay here," said Billy to his sergeant at his side, "until you hear the hoot owl cry 3 times from the direction of the barracks and the guardhouse. Then charge the opposite end of the town, firing off your carbines like hell and yelling your heads off. Make all the racket you can, and keep it up until you get 'em coming in your direction, see? Then turn and drop back slowly, egging 'em on, but holding 'em to it as long as you can. Do you get me, Bo?" From the mixture of Spanish and English and Grand Avenuish, the sergeant gleaned enough of the intent of his commander to permit him to salute and admit that he understood what was required of him. Having given his instructions, Billy Byrne rode off to the west, circled Cuervaca, and came close up to the southern edge of the little village. Here he dismounted and left his horse hidden among the outbuildings, while he crept cautiously forward to reconnoiter. He knew that the force within the village had no reason to fear attack. Villa knew where the main bodies of his enemies lay, and that no force could approach Cuervaca without a word of its coming reaching the garrison many hours in advance of the foe. That Peseta or another of the several bandit chiefs in the neighborhood would dare descend upon the garrison town never for a moment entered the calculations of the rebel leader. For these reasons Billy argued that Cuervaca would be poorly guarded. On the night he had spent there he had seen sentries before the bank, the guardhouse, and the barracks, in addition to one who paced to and fro in front of the house in which the commander of the garrison maintained his headquarters. Aside from these the town was unguarded. Nor were conditions different tonight. Billy came within 100 yards of the guardhouse before he discovered a sentinel. The fellow lolled upon his gun in front of the building, an adobe structure in the rear of the barracks. The other 3 sides of the guardhouse appeared to be unwatched. Billy threw himself upon his stomach and crawled slowly forward, stopping often. The sentry seemed asleep. He did not move. Billy reached the shadow at the side of the structure and some 50 feet from the soldier without detection. Then he rose to his feet directly beneath a barred window. Within, Bridge paced back and forth the length of the little building. He could not sleep. Tomorrow he was to be shot. Bridge did not wish to die. That very morning General Villa in person had examined him. The general had been exceedingly wroth. The sting of the theft of his funds still irritated him, but he had given Bridge no inkling as to his fate. It had remained for a fellow prisoner to do that. This man, a deserter, was to be shot, so he said, with Bridge, a fact which gave him an additional 24 hours of life, since, he asserted, General Villa wished to be elsewhere than in Cuervaca when an American was executed. Thus he could disclaim responsibility for the act. The general was to depart in the morning. Shortly after, Bridge and the deserter would be led out and blindfolded before a stone wall, if there was such a thing, or a brick wall, or an adobe wall. It made little difference to the deserter, or to Bridge either. The wall was but a trivial factor. It might go far to add romance to whomever should read of the affair later, but insofar as Bridge and the deserter were concerned, it meant nothing. A billboard, thought Bridge, bearing the slogan, "Eventually, why not now?" would have been equally as efficacious and far more appropriate. The room in which he was confined was stuffy with the odor of accumulated filth. 2 small barred windows alone gave means of ventilation. He and the deserter were the only prisoners. The latter slept as soundly as though the morrow held nothing more momentous in his destiny than any of the days which had preceded it. Bridge was moved to kick the fellow into consciousness of his impending fate. Instead, he walked to the south window to fill his lungs with the free air beyond the prison pen, and gazed sorrowfully in the starlit sky, which he should never again behold. In a low tone, Bridge crooned a snatch of the poem that he and Billy liked best. And you, my sweet Penelope, out there somewhere you wait for me, with buds of roses in your hair and kisses on your mouth. Bridge's mental vision was concentrated upon the veranda of a white-walled ranch house to the east. He shook his head angrily. It's just as well, he thought. She's not for me. Something moved upon the ground beyond the window. Bridge became suddenly intent upon the thing. He saw it rise and resolve itself into the figure of a man, and then in a low whisper came a familiar voice. There ain't no roses in my hair, but there's a barker in my shirt and another at me side. Here's one of 'em. They got kisses beat a city block. How's the door this thing fastened? The speaker was quite close to the window now, his face but a few inches from Bridge's. Billy! Ejaculated the condemned man. Surest thing you know. But about the door? Just a heavy bar on the outside, replied Bridge. Easy, commented Billy, relieved. Get ready to beat it when I open the door. I got a pony south of town that'll have to carry double for a little way tonight. God bless you, Billy, whispered Bridge fervently. Lay low a few minutes, said Billy, and moved away toward the rear of the guardhouse. A few minutes later there broke upon the night air the dismal hoot of an owl. At intervals of a few seconds it was repeated twice. The sentry before the guardhouse shifted his position and looked about. Then he settled back, transferring his weight to the other foot, and resumed his bovine meditations. The man at the rear of the guardhouse moved silently along the side of the structure until he stood within a few feet of the unsuspecting sentinel, hidden from him by the corner of the building. A heavy revolver dangled from his right hand. He held it loosely by the barrel and waited. For 5 minutes the silence of the night was unbroken. Then from the east came a single shot, followed immediately by the scattering fusillade and a chorus of hoarse cries. Billy Byrne smiled. The sentry resumed indications of quickness. From the barracks beyond the guardhouse came sharp commands and the sound of men running. From the opposite end of the town the noise of battle welled up to ominous proportions. Billy heard the soldiers stream from their quarters, and a moment later saw them trot up the street at the double. Everyone was moving toward the opposite end of the town except the lone sentinel before the guardhouse. The moment seemed propitious for his attempt. Billy peered around the corner of the guardhouse. Conditions were just as he had pictured they would be. The sentry stood gazing in the direction of the firing, his back toward the guardhouse door and Billy. With a bound the American cleared the space between himself and the unsuspecting and unfortunate soldier. The butt of the heavy revolver fell, almost noiselessly, upon the back of the sentry's head, and the man sank to the ground without even a moan. Turning to the door, Billy knocked the bar from its place. The door swung in, and Bridge slipped through to liberty. Quick, said Billy, follow me, and turned at a rapid run toward the south edge of the town. He made no effort now to conceal his movements. Speed was the only essential, and the two covered the ground swiftly and openly without any attempt to take advantage of cover. They reached Billy's horse unnoticed, and a moment later they were trotting toward the west to circle the town and regain the trail to the north and safety. To the east they heard the diminishing rifle fire of the combatants as Peseda's men fell steadily back before the defenders and drew them away from Cuervaca in accordance with Billy's plan. Like taking candy from a baby, said Billy, when the flickering lights of Cuervaca shone to the south of them, and the road ahead lay clear to the rendezvous of the brigands. Yes, agreed Bridge. But what I'd like to know, Billy, is how you found out I was there. Penelope, said Byrne, laughing. Penelope? Queried Bridge. I'm not at all sure that I follow you, Billy. Well, seeing as you're sitting on behind, you can't be leading me, returned Billy. But cutting the kid, it was a skirt tipped it off to me where you was. The beautiful Senorita of El Robo Rancho, I think Jose called her. Now are you hep? Bridge gave an exclamation of astonishment. God bless her, he said. She did that for me? She sure did, Billy assured him. And I bet an iron case she's waiting for you with those buds of roses in her hair and kisses on her mouth, you old son of a gun, you. Billy laughed happily. He was happy anyway at having rescued Bridge, and the knowledge that his friend was in love and that the girl reciprocated his affection, all of which Billy assumed as the only explanation of her interest in Bridge, only added to his joy. She ain't a greaser, is she? He asked presently. I should say not, replied Bridge. She's a perfect queen from New York City, but Billy, she's not for me. What she did was prompted by a generous heart. She couldn't care for me, Billy. Her father is a wealthy man. He could have the pick of the land, of many lands, if she cared to marry. You don't think for a minute she'd want a hobo, do you? You can't most always tell, replied Billy, a trifle sadly. I knew such a queen once, who would have chosen a mucker, if he'd let her. You're stuck on her, old man?" "I'm afraid I am, Billy," Bridge admitted. "But what's the use? Let's forget it. Oh, say, is this the horse I let you take the night you robbed the bank?" "Yes," said Billy. "Same little pony, and a mighty well behaved one too. Why?" "It's hers," said Bridge. "And she wants it back?" "She didn't say so, but I'd like to get it to her some way," said Bridge. "You can ride it back when you go," suggested Billy. "But I can't go back," said Bridge. "It was Grayson, the foreman, who made it so hot for me I had to leave. He tried to arrest me and send me to Villa." "What for?" asked Billy. "He didn't like me and wanted to get rid of me." Bridge wouldn't say that his relations with Billy had brought him into trouble. "Oh, well, I'll take it back myself then. At the same time I'll tell Penelope what a regular fellow you are, and a punch in the foreman's face for good luck." "No, you mustn't go there. They know you now. It was some of El Orobo's men you shot up day before yesterday when you took their steers from them. They recognized the pony, and one of them had seen you in Cuivaca the night of the robbery. They would be sure to get you, Billy." Shortly the two came in touch with the retreating Pesetistas who were riding slowly toward the mountain camp. Their pursuers had long since given up the chase, fearing that they might be being lured into the midst of a greater or superior force, and had returned to Cuivaca. It was nearly morning when Bridge and Billy threw themselves down upon the latter's blankets, fagged. "Well, well," murmured Billy Byrne, "little old Bridgie's found his Penelope," and fell asleep. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of The Return of the Mucker by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Joe DeNoia, Somerset, New Jersey. Barbara again. Captain Billy Byrne rode out of the hills the following afternoon upon a pinto pony that showed the whites of its eyes and a wicked rim around the iris, and kept its ears perpetually flattened backwards. At the end of a lariat trailed the Brazos pony, for Billy, laughing aside Bridge's pleas, was on his way to El Orobo Rancho to return the stolen horse to its fair owner. At the moment of departure Pesita had asked Billy to ride by way of Jose's to instruct the old Indian that he should bear word to one Esteban that Pesita required his presence. It is a long ride from the retreat of the Pesetistas to Jose's squalid hut, especially if one be leading an extra horse, and so it was that darkness had fallen long before Billy arrived in sight of Jose's. Dismounting some distance from the hut, Billy approached cautiously, since the world is filled with dangers for those who are beyond the law, and one may not be too careful. Billy could see a light showing through a small window, and toward this he made his way. A short distance from Jose's is another, larger structure from which the former inhabitants had fled the wrath of Pesita. It was dark and apparently tenantless, but as a matter of fact a pair of eyes chanced at the very moment of Billy's coming to be looking out through the open doorway. The owner turned and spoke to someone behind him. "Jose has another visitor," he said. "Possibly this one is less harmless than the other. He comes with great caution. Let us investigate." 3 other men rose from their blankets upon the floor and joined the speaker. They were all armed and clothed in the nondescript uniforms of Villistas. Billy's back was toward them as they sneaked from the hut in which they were intending to spend the night and crept quietly toward him. Billy was busily engaged in peering through the little window into the interior of the old Indian's hovel. He saw an American in earnest conversation with Jose. Who could the man be? Billy did not recognize him, but presently Jose answered the question. "It shall be done as you wish, Senor Grayson," he said. Ah, thought Billy, the foreman of El Orobo. I wonder what business he has with the old scoundrel, and at night. What other thoughts Billy might have had upon the subject were rudely interrupted by 4 energetic gentlemen in his rear, who leaped upon him simultaneously and dragged him to the ground. Billy made no outcry, but he fought none the less strenuously for his freedom, and he fought after the manner of Grand Avenue, which is not a pretty, however effective, way it may be. But 4 against 1 when all the advantages lie with the 4 are heavy odds, and when Grayson and Jose ran out to investigate, and the ranch foreman added his weight to that of the others, Billy was finally subdued. That each of his antagonists would carry mementos of the battle for many days was slight compensation for the loss of liberty. However, it was some. After disarming their captive and tying his hands at his back, they jerked him to his feet and examined him. "Who are you?" asked Grayson. "What are you doing sneaking around spying on me, eh?" "If you want to know who I am, Bo," replied Billy, "go ask the Harlem Hurricane. And as for spying on youse, I wasn't. But from the looks I guess youse need spying, you tin horn." A pony whinnied a short distance from the hut. "That must be his horse," said one of the Villistas, and walked away to investigate, returning shortly after with the pinto pony and Brazos. The moment Grayson saw the latter he gave an exclamation of understanding. "I know him now," he said. "You've made a good catch, Sergeant. This is a fellow who robbed the bank at Cuervaca. I recognize him from the descriptions I've had of him, and the fact that he's got the Brazos pony makes it a cinch. Villa ought to promote you for this." "Yep," interjected Billy. "He ought to make you an admiral at least, but you ain't got me home yet, and it'll take more than 4 Dagos and a tin horn to do it." "They'll get you there all right, my friend," Grayson assured him. "Now come along." They bundled Billy into his own saddle, and shortly after the little party was winding southward along the river in the direction of El Orobo Rancho, with the intention of putting up there for the balance of the night, where their prisoner could be properly secured and guarded. As they rode away from the dilapidated hut of the Indian, the old man stood silhouetted against the rectangle of dim light which marked the open doorway, and shook his fist at the back of the departing ranch foreman. "El cochino!" he cackled, and turned back into the hut. At El Orobo Rancho, Barbara walked to and fro outside the ranch house. Within, her father sat reading beneath the rays of an oil lamp. From the quarters of the men came the strains of guitar music, and an occasional loud laugh indicated the climax of some of Eddie Shorter's famous Kansas farmer stories. Barbara was upon the point of returning indoors when her attention was attracted by the approach of half a dozen horsemen. They reined into the ranch yard and dismounted before the office building. Wondering a little who came so late, Barbara entered the house, mentioning casually to her father that which she had seen. The ranch owner, now always fearful of attack, was upon the point of investigating when Grayson rode up to the veranda and dismounted. Barbara and her father were at the door as he ascended the steps. "Good news!" exclaimed the foreman. "I've got the bank robber, and Brazos too. Caught the sneaking coyote up the river a bit." He had almost said Jose's, but caught himself in time. "Someone's been cutting the wire at the north side of the north pasture, and I was riding up to see if I can catch him at it," he explained. "He's an American?" asked the boss. "Looks like it, but he's at the heart of a greaser," replied Grayson. "Some of Villa's men are with me, and they're going to take him to Cuervaca tomorrow." Neither Barbara nor her father seemed to enthuse much. To them an American was an American here in Mexico, where every hand was against their race. That at home they might have looked with disgust upon the same man did not alter their attitude here. That no American should take sides against his own people. Barbara said as much to Grayson. "Why, this fellow's one of Poseda's officers," exclaimed Grayson. "He don't deserve no sympathy from us, nor from no other Americans. Poseda has sworn to kill every American that falls into his hands, and this fellow's with him to help him do it. He's a bad un." "I can't help what he may do," insisted Barbara. "He's an American, and I for one would never be a party to his death at the hands of a Mexican, and it will mean death to him to be taken to Cuervaca." "Well, miss," said Grayson, "you won't have to be responsible. I'll take all the responsibility there is, and welcome. I just thought you'd like to know we had him." He was addressing his employer. The latter nodded, and Grayson turned and left the room. Outside he cast a sneering laugh back over his shoulder and swung into his saddle. In front of the men's quarters he drew rein again and shouted Eddie's name. Shorter came to the door. "Get your 6-shooter and a rifle and come over to the office. I want to see you a minute." Eddie did as he was bid, and when he entered the little room he saw 4 Mexicans lolling about, smoking cigarettes, while Grayson stood before a chair in which sat a man with his arms tied behind his back. Grayson turned to Eddie. "This party here is the slick un that robbed the bank, and got away on that there Brazos pony that miserable bookkeeping dude give him. The sergeant here and his men are going to take him to Cuervaca in the morning. You stand guard over him till midnight, then they'll relieve you. They gotta get some sleep first though, and I gotta get some supper. Don't stand for no funny business now, Eddie." Grayson admonished him and was on the point of leaving the office when a thought occurred to him. "Say, Shorter," he said, "there ain't no way of getting out of the little bedroom and back there except through this room. The windows are too small for a big man to get through. I tell you what, we'll lock him up in there, and then you won't have to worry none, and neither will we. We can just spread out them Navajos there and go to sleep plump agin the door, and there won't nobody have to relieve you all night." "Sure," said Eddie, "leave it to me. I'll watch the slicker." Satisfied that their prisoner was safe for the night, the Villistas and Grayson departed, after seeing him safely locked in the back room. At the mention by the foreman of his guards' names, Eddie and Shorter, Billy had studied the face of the young American cowpuncher, for the 2 names had aroused within his memory a tantalizing suggestion that they should be very familiar. Yet he could connect them in no way with anyone he had known in the past, and he was quite sure he was never before had set eyes upon this man. Sitting in the dark, with nothing to occupy him, Billy let his mind dwell upon the identity of his jailer, until, as may have happened to you, nothing in the whole world seemed equally as important as the solution to the mystery. Even his impending fate faded into nothingness by comparison with the momentous question as to where he had heard the name Eddie Shorter before. As he sat puzzling his brain over the inconsequential matter, something stirred upon the floor close to his feet, and presently he jerked back a booted foot that a rat had commenced to gnaw upon. Hell of a place to stick a guy, mused Billy, and with a bunch of men-eating rats. Hey! And he turned his face toward the door. You, Eddie, come here. Eddie approached the door and listened. What do you want? He asked. None of your funny business, you know. I'm from Shawnee, Kansas, I am, and they don't come no slicker from nowhere on earth. You can't fool me. Shawnee, Kansas. Eddie Shorter. The whole puzzle cleared in Billy's mind in an instant. So you're Eddie Shorter of Shawnee, Kansas, are you? Called Billy. Well, I know your maw, Eddie, and if I had such a maw as you got, I wouldn't be down here wasting my time working alongside a lot of Dagos. But that ain't what I started to say, which was that I want a light in here. The goddamn rats are trying to chaw off me kicks. When they're done with them, they'll climb up after me, and old man Via'd be sore as a pup. You know my maw? Asked Eddie, and there was a wistful note in his voice. Aw, shucks, you don't know her. That's just some of your funny slicker business. You want to get me in there, then you try to get around me some sort of way to let you escape. But I'm too slick for that. On the level, Eddie, I know your maw, persisted Billy. I've been in your maw's house just a few weeks ago. Remember the horsehair sofa between the windows? Remember the Bible on a little marble-top table? Yeah? And Tej? Well, Tej is croaked, but your maw and your paws ain't. And they want you back, Eddie. I don't care if you believe me, son, or not, but your maw was mighty good to me, and you promised me that you'll right her, and then go back home as fast as you can. It ain't everybody's got a swell maw like that, and them that is ought to be good to 'em. Beyond the closed door, Eddie's jaw was commencing to tremble. Memory was flooding his heart and his eyes with sweet recollections of an ample breast where he used to pillow his head, of a big, capable hand that was wont to smooth his brow and stroke back his red hair. Eddie gulped. You ain't joshing me? He asked. Billy Byrne caught the tremor in his voice. I ain't kidding you, son, he said. What in hell do you take me for? One of those greasy Dagos? You and I are Americans. I wouldn't string a home guy down here in this godforsaken neck of the woods. Billy heard the lock turn, and a moment later the door was cautiously opened, revealing Eddie safely ensconced between two six-shooters. That's right, Eddie, said Billy with a laugh. Don't you take no chances, no matter how much sob stuff I hand you. For, I'll give it to you straight, if I get the chance, I'll make my getaway. But I can't do it with my flipper's trust, and you with a brace of gas sitting on me. Let's have a light, Eddie. That won't do nobody any harm, and it might discourage the rats. Eddie backed across the office to a table where stood a small lamp. Keeping an eye through the door on his prisoner, he lighted the lamp and carried it into the back room, setting it upon a commode which stood in one corner. You really seen Maw? He asked. Is she well? Looked well when I seen her, said Billy, but she wants her boy back a whole lot. I guess she'd look better if he walked in there some day. I'll do it, cried Eddie. The minute they get money for the pay, I'll hike. Tell me your name. I'll ask her if she remembers you when I get home. Gee, but I wish I was walking in that front door now. She never knew my name, said Billy, but you tell her you seen the bow that mussed up the two yeggmen who rolled on her, and they were trying to croak her with a butcher's knife. I guess she ain't forgot. Me and my pal were beating it. He was on the square, but the dicks was after me, and she let us have money to make our getaway. She's all right, kid. There came a knock on the outer office door. Eddie sprang back into the front room, closing and locking the door behind him, just as Barbara entered. Eddie, she asked, may I see the prisoner? I want to talk to him. You want to talk with a bank robber? Exclaimed Eddie. Why, you ain't crazy, are you, Miss Barbara? No, I'm not crazy, but I want to speak with him alone for a minute, Eddie. Please. Eddie hesitated. He knew that Grayson would be angry if he let the boss's daughter into that back room alone with an outlaw and a robber, and the boss himself would probably be inclined to have Eddie drawn and quartered, but it was hard to refuse Miss Barbara anything. Where is he? She asked. Eddie jerked a thumb in the direction of the door. The key was still in the lock. Go to the window and look at the moon, Eddie, suggested the girl. It's perfectly gorgeous tonight. Please, Eddie, as he still hesitated. Eddie shook his head and moved slowly toward the window. There can't be nobody refusing you nothing, miss, he said, especially when you got your heart set on it. That's a dear, Eddie, purred the girl, and moved swiftly across the room to the locked door. As she turned the key in the lock, she felt a little shiver of nervous excitement run through her. What sort of man would he be, this hardened outlaw and robber, this renegade American who had cast his lot with the avowed enemies of his own people, she wondered. Only her desire to learn of Bridge's fate urged her to attempt so distasteful an interview, but she dared not ask another to put the question for her, since should her complicity in Bridge's escape, provided of course that he had escaped, become known to Villa, the fate of the Americans at El Robo would be definitely sealed. She turned the knob and pushed the door open, slowly. A man was sitting in a chair in the center of the room. His back was toward her. He was a big man. His broad shoulders loomed immense about the back of the rude chair. A shock of black hair, rumpled and tousled, covered a well-shaped head. At the sound of the door creaking upon its hinges he turned his face in her direction, and as his eyes met hers all four went wide in surprise and incredulity. "Billy!" she cried. "Barbara! You?" And Billy rose to his feet, his bound hands struggling to be free. The girl closed the door behind her and crossed to him. "You robbed the bank, Billy?" she asked. "It was you, after the promises you made me to live straight, always, for my sake?" Her voice trembled with emotion. The man could see that she suffered, and yet he felt his own anguish too. "But you were married," he said. "I saw it in the papers. What do you care now, Barbara? I'm nothing to you." "I'm not married, Billy," she cried. "I couldn't marry Mr. Mallory. I tried to make myself believe that I could, but at last I knew that I did not love him and never could, and I wouldn't marry a man I didn't love. I never dreamed that it was you here, Billy," she went on. "I came to ask you about Mr. Bridge. I wanted to know if he escaped, or if oh, this awful country. They think no more of human life here than a butcher thinks of the life of the animal he dresses." A sudden light illuminated Billy's mind. Why had it not occurred to him before? This was Bridge's Penelope. The woman he loved was loved by his best friend, and she had sent a messenger to him, to Billy, to save her lover. She had come here to the office tonight to question a stranger, a man she thought an outlaw and a robber, because she could not rest without word from the man she loved. Billy stiffened. He was hurt to the bottom of his heart, but he did not blame Bridge. It was fate. Nor did he blame Barbara because she loved Bridge. Bridge was more her kind anyway. He was a college guy. Billy was only a mucker. "Bridge got away all right," he said. "And say, he didn't have nothing to do with pulling off that safe cracking. I done it myself. He didn't know I was in town, and I didn't know he was there. He's the squarest guy in the world, Bridge is. He followed me that night and took a shot at me, thinking I was the robber all right, but not knowing it was me. He got my horse, and when he found it was me he made me take your pony and make my getaway, for he knew Villa's men would croak me sure if they caught me. You can't blame him for that, can you? Him and I are good pals. He couldn't do nothing else. It was him that made me bring your pony back to you. It's in the corral now, I reckon. I was just bringing it back when they got me. Now you better go. This ain't no place for you, and I ain't had no sleep for so long I'm almost dead." His tones were cool. He appeared bored by her company, though as a matter of fact his heart was breaking with love for her. Love that he believed unrequited, and he yearned to tear loose his bonds and crush her in his arms. It was Barbara's turn now to be heard. She drew herself up. "I am sorry I've disturbed your rest," she said, and walked away, her head in the air. But all the way back to the ranch house she kept repeating over and over to herself, "Tomorrow they will shoot him. Tomorrow they will shoot him. Tomorrow they will shoot him." Chapter 13.